have you all here. I'm Pastor Karen from Shepherd of the Lake. I am Pastor Karen from Shepherd of the Lake, and glad you're here this morning. It's a beautiful morning here in Minnesota. Last year, this is our second annual of Making All Things New, and last year it was cold and it was very slippery. So we were wondering who would show, wondering how it would go, and grateful for those who ventured out, and we're glad that you're here as well. It's going to be a wonderful morning with amazing speakers. We do have a small crowd here, but we have 80 people registered from all over the country, some even in Canada, so we are grateful for all who are here this morning. You will also be able to find it recorded on our YouTube channel for later if you want to view it again. So I first want to begin by giving thanks for those who are part of this day, and I want to give thanks to our team, our mental health and addiction team here at Shepherd. I wanted you to come up and just say your names and what it is, why you're part of this team. So if Bill and Melissa, if you would come up, and Sheila is on the questions and answers. So here you go, Melissa.
Good morning. Oops. Is it on?
Is it on?
Okay. Good morning. I'm Melissa Zapp, and I'm part of the mental health and addiction team here at Shepherd of the Lake. Our team formed in the summer of 2020, so it's been an interesting journey thus far, building the ministry and coming alongside things that are already happening within our faith communities, but just trying to build a safer space to talk about issues that related to mental health, addiction, and recovery. We are so pleased to be hosting this event this morning and hope that you learn and feel supported as you live and do life. Phil?
Just who you are and why you're here.
You didn't say much personally, so I'll do that. I'm on the team as a retired family doctor, and I've been a member here for 35 years. And my father was an alcoholic, but around age 50, thankfully, he discovered AA and was sober the rest of his life. And as far as I know, my mother would call me every once in a while, as you folks know, but she didn't call, and that was good news. And then I have a daughter, my youngest daughter, who developed schizophrenia at age 19, and thankfully she got help and is well controlled on medication, and she works in food service at Johanna Shores Presbyterian Home in Arden Hills, and they love her, and she loves working there.
Thank you, Bill.
Thank you.
All right. Can I pass it to Sheila briefly? No, you're good.
Hi, I'm Sheila McNeil. I also have a background, both sides, addiction and mental health, with my family. My mother was a schizophrenic and bipolar long before it was talked about. And my ex-husband happened to be an alcoholic, which I didn't know at the time when I married him, but many years later it surfaced. So for me, this has been a really good journey being on this committee. Thank you.
Thank you. All right, thank you. And so thank you for all who are here. Also want to thank our team, our sound team, for Pete Bliss and Rex, for you being here, and our speakers, that you are here, for Lexi and Carla, as you come with us to share stories of experience, hope, that you bring that to us, Lexi and Carla, as you come with us to share with us how we can go alongside others as they live and love those who are addicted. So thank you, and let us now begin with a word of prayer. Oh, gracious God, we thank you for this day as we enter in as your children and learn and know how it is to be in this world with all who we love, all who you love, and help us to receive all that is given. Thank you, Lord, again for this time. Be with each speaker as they give themselves over to in service for you. In your name we pray. Amen. All right, Lexi, thank you for being here this morning and to bringing yourself as you are. It's been very fun to talk to you over texting and conversation. I just know the warmth that comes from you. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. It's just an honor and a privilege to be here with you today. And, and those of you online, I'm really grateful that I get to stand before you today as a woman in long-term recovery from the disease of addiction, because I am one of the lucky ones. And normally I would ask that everybody in the audience just, close your eyes for a moment. And those of you online, you can close your eyes for a moment too. And then I would like you to raise your hand if you yourself are a person in long-term recovery from the disease of addiction. Okay. And then keep those hands up. Are you a person who loves someone with the disease of addiction? And I asked you to keep your hands up because you got to love yourself to be able to recover from the disease of addiction. Okay? And keep your eyes closed, but put your hands down. How many of you love someone that is steeped in the disease of addiction that you currently are suffering with them through that? Okay, great. So everybody can open your eyes. And I know I can't count those of you online, but I am 100% certain that the majority of us raised our hands. And every room that you go into, at least 4 out of 5 people are going to raise their hands to that question today. Addiction is a disease, and it is the #1 cause of accidental death in our country today. So it touches all of us. It touches each and every one of us. So now I also want to tell you that I'm in my 50s, so I absolutely have to wear my glasses to see you, but I have to take them off to read. And there's a couple of notes I put on my phone before I share my story. I wanted to make sure I said. So I promise you I'm not going to stand up here and read from my phone the whole time, or check my tweets, or see who's popping up on Instagram to say, Lexi's speaking. I'm not going to do that. But I do want to say these things, and if I don't read it, I probably won't say it. So, so forgive me for a minute while I can't see you. And then I've also asked for a timekeeper, because this topic is so vast, and it's been a primary driver in my life since, I don't think I said this, I have been sober since May 16th of 2011. And during that journey, it has also become my primary work as well as my personal life. So we just did a prayer, but normally I would ask that we just take a moment and just really embrace all those people out there suffering from the disease of addiction, suffering from shame and stigma, suffering from a feeling of isolation or exclusion, suffering from sickness or death, or just life is very lifey. It just is. So thank you for holding those people in your heart. Then I want to tell you, I am speaking solely as myself. What I say is solely my opinion. It's based on no other agency, community, or institution. I'm here today to share my experience, strength, and hope with you. And my sole desire is to leave you impacted in a way and where you feel more connected, where you feel hopeful, and that there's maybe someone you can turn to share your life with. There are so many theories as to why addiction happens, why it continues, why it is so hard to recover from, and I'm just leaving you with mine. So there's multiple entry points into the disease of addiction, and there are multiple solutions to the disease of addiction, and this is simply mine. It's really important that you understand what I'm saying. That's why I've said it now a couple times, because for sure, we are unified in that stigma and shame is a killer. People walking around in stigma and shame from this disease do not have the capacity to ask for help. And that is a killer. And so our responsibility is to talk about this disease so that we get to the point where we talk about it like breast cancer. Some of you might remember when there was a time when we couldn't say breast cancer out loud in public, or like we talk about AIDS. And it's our responsibility to get to the point where we treat it like we treat cancer, like we treat heart disease, like we treat diabetes, where reoccurrence can happen, and that doesn't mean that the person is bad. And that doesn't mean that the person doesn't want to recover. So hope, community, conversations, these things I know for sure help. So thank you. I can put my glasses back on now and see you. Okay. So as I said, oh, and also take a moment and look at me. I already said that I'm a person in long-term recovery from the disease of addiction. But if you looked at me before I tell you my story, I just want you to notice, what do you think about me? Do you think that I look like a person that has the disease of addiction? Do you think that I have an education that allows me to be up here on this stage, or to have accomplished some of the things that I've accomplished? Maybe some of you saw my bio. And do you think that my parents are white? Do you think that I came from upper middle class? What do you think about me when you look at me? And I ask you that question to consider, maybe make a note in your mind, the 3 things you think about me. And I ask you to consider that because we do a lot of not my backyard, not my family, not my community, not my school, not my church, not my, and I know we don't do that here in this audience, and I know we don't do that here at this church. So when I say we, I mean the global we. We do that where we other people, where we assume that they come from a particular and distinct background or socioeconomic class that causes the disease of addiction or mental health. And that is not true. Senators, doctors, school teachers, the wonderful people that pick up my garbage and my recycling, every socioeconomic class is impacted by the disease of addiction and mental health, and it is not those people over there. So that's why I asked you to kind of get a sense of what you think I am or my background is before I start to tell my story. So I won't make you do the math. As I already said, I'm in my 50s. So I was born in 1969. And I'm going to tell you my story. I'm going to tell you my background, and then I'm going to tell you what happened, and then I'm going to tell you my recovery, okay? And I'm going to try not to get into the gory details of my when I was most steeped in the disease of addiction, because I don't feel like it's necessary for me to bring you there to walk you through this journey. I'm an open book. I'm more than happy to take any questions. I'm more than happy to share with you anything that's happened or occurred in my life, because every single step I've taken in my life has led me to the woman that stands before you today. And today, I love the woman that stands before you today. And that's not always true every single day. And that's not true sometimes when I'm steeped in problems that I feel insurmountable. But most days, that's very true for me. And that was not true for me when I was steeped in the disease of addiction. So my story starts out in 1969. My mother, and also I want to say my family, they did the best that they could with what they had. And my story, for those of you that might have a trigger, you can tune out. You don't have to continue to listen to what I say if it's painful for you. Okay? So in 1969, I was born into a family of origin that my father was a violent alcoholic. I am a triple winner. I have the disease of addiction spanning through both sides of my family of origin. I am a person in long-term recovery, and I love people who have died from this disease and who still struggle with this disease. So I've got all the winning things. And I will tell you today that I stand before you and say, I am so grateful for my addiction because it led me to my recovery, and I have a path to live my life and be a contribution that I did not have. And some of the people that I grew up with do not have the disease of addiction, and they don't have the same opportunity to use tools that I have because I'm in recovery. I believe in the 12-step program, and that's the path for me. And that's why I opened with, there's multiple paths. The 12 steps are not the only way. That's working for me. So my family of origin, my father was a violent alcoholic, and my mother came from poverty. My mother was the oldest of 5 children, and her mother was an alcoholic, and that alcoholism was induced when it manifested in full force for her, was when her husband died, when she had 5 young children at home and no way to survive that. And she was left really alone. And her story, my grandmother's story, was that, she was facing stigma from families of origin. So she was Lutheran, and my grandfather, who she fell in love with, was Jewish. And at the time, that was very not okay. And so both families kind of abandoned her for her choice in her love when her husband died. So she had to really survive that, and she became very alcoholic. And my mother lived through a lot of unsafe environments and abuse. And I believe it to be true that the experiences that I had were much, much better than the experiences that my mother had. So when I was about 2, my mother left my father. And, also when I was born, my mother almost died, giving birth to me. So my life started out not very safe. My life started out where from the moment I took my first breath, my mother was not available to me. And she survived giving birth to me. And then she survived some pretty extreme abuse and left. Then my mother fell in love with an amazing man and married him when I was about 3 and a half. And there's some story and background there that I'm going to skip over too, but I want to point to my mother married my father, who I consider my father because he raised me from the time I was 3 until I was about 14 when they got divorced in a very ugly divorce. He is a black man. And my father and my mother, my dad, and my mom got married 4 years after it was legal to have interracial marriages. Okay? So it was kind of like a repeat of what my grandmother experienced in terms of stigma, shame, community. We did not fit anywhere. And, you know, if you met my dad, you would fall in love with him instantly. And my dad would stand up here next to me, and he's like the color of black coffee without any cream, right? And he would stand up here next to me, and he would have this amazing, beautiful smile, and he would say to you, "What, don't you see the family resemblance?" You know? And so that's how we went through life. I love my dad. I love him. And I didn't get it at all, and I had 2 sisters from his first marriage and my brother from my mom's first marriage. So we were literally, and my dad played pro ball for the Minnesota Vikings, okay? And my mom was this beautiful woman who was very outspoken, very used to being in charge because she took care of those 4 younger siblings and her mother. And so she had a sense of, I will be in control. And she was absolutely beautiful and absolutely, she walked into a room and she commanded it. She's passed away now, and I miss her. And so our upbringing consisted of, we really didn't fit. And the black community wasn't entirely comfortable with us, and the white community was not happy with us. And if you recall back to the 70s, there was still like housing rules. We couldn't live in certain neighborhoods because my father was black. We couldn't buy there. And so somewhere around the age of like 6 or 7, I became really aware that it was incredibly uncomfortable to be in my own skin. That it was not okay or safe to be in any community that we were in. There was always somebody who was unhappy that we were there. I remember a time after one of the Super Bowls, my dad went to 4, that we were in a car, and he came from Memphis, Tennessee. And we were in a car, and it was a long Cadillac, and they didn't have seatbelts then, and I was sitting on the middle seat, you know, in between the 2 front seats on the seat pad, or on the armrest, and my brother and my sisters are in the back seat, and I'm sitting up there, and we're driving, and a cop pulls us over, and it was not good. I literally felt like my dad might be killed, and my mother might be, I don't know what, and it was terrifying. And those are the experiences that, for me, as I've said, there's multiple entries into the disease of addiction. Those are the experiences that kept coming at me, that it's just not safe and not okay. And whatever I did, I just had to make sure I just fit in, and that it was like, no, my job was to make sure everybody was okay, and that I was safe, and that they were safe, and therefore we just don't talk about things that don't work. We just pretend like it didn't happen and keep going. So that's kind of my family of origin, and as I said, I am the one that got addiction. And oftentimes, my siblings, significant others will say, how come you're okay? And I just simply say, because I have a way to live my life. The other things that occurred to me were that, from the time I was about 2, a family member raped and molested me multiple times. Me and one of my other sisters, and probably my other siblings as well, but I know for sure that me and my one other sister, because I recall when I got old enough, she was my baby sister, and I loved her. And I recall being with my uncle, knowing what was coming, knowing that my sister was there, and I must have been like 8, and putting myself in front of my sister to try and save her from what I knew was coming. And it didn't matter anyways, because once he was done with me, he just moved on to her. Somehow, none of the adults in my life who loved me, who knew my mother, this is not, typically when things like this happen in families, it goes generationally. But nobody identified it. Nobody could see it. And as I said, I grew up being, we just let it go. We don't stay, I grew up feeling like and I still struggle today with defining, is it me or is this a toxic, not okay, abusive environment? I really struggle. I have to work really hard to identify that. Like, is this, okay and safe? An environment that I'm in, whether it's, social or any other situation, I'm much, much better. But I still struggle somewhat with that because in my family of origin, you just had to hold on. And you just kept going. Another thing that I had experienced, so I don't know how many of you are familiar with ACEs scores. So I'm like, oh my gosh, I'm a winner. I got them all. And that is that's a level setting for us in communities to be able to talk about trauma. So I experienced homelessness as a youth. I experienced that when my parents were going through, they're together, they're not together, they can't make it work out, they can make it work out, my mom and my dad, Oscar and Pam. And, we went through times of extreme poverty, obviously, if we had homelessness. And during those times, it was very stressful and a lot of loss. And so I think that's enough about all that. That gives you the background. And I want to point to, again, some people don't have that. Some people come from families that are like whole and complete in one household, and they have all the resources, and they don't have any of that, and somebody still gets the disease of addiction. So it's not when you see, that's why I asked you in the beginning, like, what do you see when you look at me? Not everybody has my background. Some people just have the disease of more, which is really addiction. I cannot drink a glass of wine. I want more. Okay? And I struggle with that too. I will be a workaholic, anything that is more that can remove me from my own thinking or can have me just be producing, I want to do. So what happened for me was in my 40s, and I'm here with my amazing significant other today, whom I love, and he has heard my story on many, many occasions, so this is not a surprise to him. But I had a man that I loved that passed away from this disease, and his name was Steve Rumler. And out of that loss, what happened for me, and he died 30 days into my recovery, and to his recovery, he relapsed. And 30 days after that, we started a foundation, his family, who I have an amazing loving relationship with. Affectionately, they refer to me as their daughter-in-love, because we were to be married, Steve and I, but instead of we were planning our wedding, I had to plan his funeral. So that's what happened there. And out of that, it really put me on this entirely different path. And can you give me a time check? Okay, good. I feel like I've been talking for a really long time, but I haven't. Out of Steve's death, I didn't know what to do. I felt like it was my fault. I felt like I didn't understand the disease of addiction. I thought I didn't even know I had the disease of addiction when he died. I literally thought, if I save this man, if I make it okay for him, we'll be great. We'll have this dream life. He loved me. And that was clear. He was also my first boyfriend in high school and college, and we split up back then, and then we came back together again in our 40s. And, for me, I had been in another relationship. I had been in a fairly significant relationship in my life and had a daughter with my daughter's father. And then we could not make it work. And so we split up amicably. And I didn't date anyone because I thought, I am not going to have what happened to me happen to my daughter. I'm not. And I just thank you, God, that she hasn't had to go through those traumas. Like I broke the cycle I broke it. And that's just, I'm so grateful. So grateful that she did not have to experience the rape, abuse, neglect, and trauma. Now, that's not to say that she didn't experience suffering, and, she did, because she loved Steve, and he was a part of her life. And when he died, because she was aware, she was part of all of it, when he died, she said to me, Mommy, in tears, sobbing on a couch in our living room, why didn't he just listen to us? Why didn't he just listen to us and stop? Why didn't he just stop? And gosh, do we have any Kleenex? It's okay if we don't. So that's what happens when you start wearing mascara again. For many years, I couldn't wear any. Oh, thank you. But talk about my daughter, and I'm going to cry every time. But okay. So my daughter didn't have to experience the things I experienced, and what for me, when she was about 3, is when her dad and I split up, and I didn't date anyone. I was like, I can't bring anyone. How could I ever trust anybody? I don't know. I'm not going to expose her to that. And then Steve and I reconnected, and Isabella was about 6. And I knew him, and I knew his family, and I had loved him before, and I felt safe. And I knew he'd never hurt my daughter intentionally, and I knew he'd love her like she was his. And so we started dating. And very, very quickly, he asked me to marry him, and we started moving forward and making all these plans. And what happened for Steve was that, I think most of us in here probably know about opioids now. Anybody not know about opioids that I can see? Just raise your hand. Okay, everybody knows about opioids. Steve was one of the people that was prescribed opioids. He had the disease of addiction before he was prescribed opioids to treat his chronic pain. That was very clear. He should never have been prescribed opioids. But Steve's journey was this Ulysses journey where he went to his primary care doctor, I'm in pain, and then he went to a psychologist and, all of the doctors, all of the specialists, and he'd keep ending up back at his primary care doctor in pain. And the reality was that he started self-medicating with alcohol, and they thought, well, let's try opioids, because we all know Purdue Pharma and the Sackler brothers and the marketing that was done. And if you don't know, I could talk to you about that for a long time. But what they did was they really invented new terms. Like they told doctors, you're opiophobic. If you're unwilling to prescribe, you are opiophobic. They made up a word. Let's just make up words to have new realities in medicine. I mean, they really did do that. And so it really skyrocketed opioid addiction in our country. And we knew some of the problems that we have now would come along with this journey of trying to right the ship with our nation's prescribing practices. So Steve died in 2011, and out of that, his family and I did not know what to do, particularly his mother and I were like, it's our fault. Oh my gosh, we should have been there. We should have taken that phone call. We should have done this intervention. We should have forced this outcome. And because of all of that, and because I thought, I'm just going to get him safe. I'm going to remove all of the chemicals from our house. I'm going to get rid of all the pills. I'm going to get rid of all the alcohol and any other things. And then he'll come home from treatment, and we'll be okay. And then when Steve died, it's possibly the biggest gift that anyone could have ever given me, because he left me with myself. And I really had to look and be like, I have the disease of addiction. This isn't codependency. This isn't, I only need Al-Anon. And it allowed me to start my recovery journey, which has given me this life that I never would have dreamt I deserved or was good enough for. And one of the things about not being qualified on paper, not looking good on paper, is that you don't know what you don't know about what you're not supposed to do. So during that time period when we started a nonprofit, people started asking me to do things that I didn't know I couldn't do. And I was just suffering so much that I just wanted to feel better. And I thought, if I can just do something. I also felt like I needed redemption from somebody or something, because Steve died and it was my fault. And, it took me years to really learn that this is a disease and that I have no power over anyone else's journey. I do not. And not only that, but my belief is that I have a higher power that has my back. Like, I am my higher power's favorite. I am. And therefore, I know that each and every one of you and all the people out there suffering from the multitude of things, including disease and mental health, has their own higher power. And it's not me. But it took me a really long time to learn that. And so during this journey, what happened for me is that I did go into the 12-step program. And I think for probably the first 3 years, I cried every single day. But it was the only place in the rooms of the 12-step program that I felt okay. And so I went a couple times a day, often. And that gave me access to the tools and the things that I needed to be able to recover and to build some recovery capital. And along that journey, I got to do some really cool things. Like, I got to write a couple laws. One of them named after Steve. So I got to write our 911 Good Samaritan plus naloxone law that allows each and every one of us to have access to carry naloxone to administer it in good faith to save a life. I got to help write and spearhead a law on creating a licensing fee on all manufacturers and drug distributors in our state so that we had resources to be able to address the disease of addiction, specifically opioids. I got to write a couple appropriations. I got to help cause the transformation in the way in which our nation talks about addiction. I got to do that. But none of that would be possible if it wasn't for the fact that I have an incredible network and resource of women who are in recovery, who stood with me, stand with me, and tell me things like, we love you and you're enough. And you belong up on that stage. And though, that really wasn't the message that I got when I was younger. Some people still honestly believe that people should just stop. Some people honestly still believe that it's a choice. And again, there's medical science and there's a whole bunch of pathways, and I don't know the right one. I know the right one for me. But I do want to say there's nothing that was in Steve that wanted to keep using. He died of an opioid overdose with mixed drug toxicity. And there was nothing in him that he wanted to be free of it. He wanted to be better. I know people every single day die of this disease. It is as many people die, you can think of a 747 flying through the air, filled with passengers, and that plane crashing on a daily basis, and everybody on that plane dying. That is how many people die of the disease of addiction every day in our nation. Every day. And I can guarantee that the people that die have people that love them, that are standing for them to be better. I can guarantee you that the consequences of their life in their journey with addiction, that they would give anything to not have those consequences again. I can guarantee you that. I am sure of it. So that leaves us as a nation and as a people and as a community and as a family and as an individual in a really tough spot. What is the solution, and why does it work for me to have a higher power that I can say has my back, and therefore I don't need to know the answers to my life's problems? But that doesn't work for Nancy or Bob or Sue or Steve or 107,000 individuals who died of the disease of addiction last year just from overdoses. It didn't work for any of them. So that brings me back to what I do know is that shame and stigma is something that we can address now. Shame, stigma, not talking about the disease of addiction, not talking about who we are, is something that we can address today. Is something that we can be proud of when we're in recovery, whether it's a day or 12 years or 30 years or 75 years. Those are things that we can change and be proud of. So back in 2011, when Steve died, we started a foundation in his name. And out of that work, we have naloxone, we have a revenue stream, of nearly $17 million a year coming into our state to address things. We have senators and members of the House that are willing to talk about their stories of their own recovery or their lost loved ones publicly to make different laws to cause better public health. We have a network of first responders, faith communities, and everything in between, willing to work together in communities to address this topic. So what is missing? Why is it worse? I don't know. And I think it's a bigger problem than I can solve on my own. I know there's a lot of people who are a lot smarter than I am in a lot of ways working on it. And it's a precarious journey. It's not every single day that I feel like, for me, my compulsion, because the disease of addiction is a mental obsession coupled with a compulsion. It really is. It's a brain disorder that we can measure, we can see scientifically, we can see where the brain lights up around addiction. And most of the time, for me, the compulsion to use drugs or alcohol to mitigate life has been removed, but not all the time. There are days where I still am, I just want to feel better. I just want to feel okay. And for people like me, that's really dangerous. It's really dangerous. For people like me, that's a time when you have to pause. You have to pause, you have to cocoon, you have to reach out to your people. Actually, cocooning is not a great thing to do for people like me. You usually want to put yourself into the middle of the herd. You usually want to, for me, I usually want to put myself in the middle of the herd and not be alone. Because when I'm left with myself, when I feel like that, for me, it's like being in a bad neighborhood at night in the dark by myself. That's what it's like for me. It's not safe. Okay. So now I feel like I want to, in the last little bit of time here, leave you with some hopefulness. I have this amazing almost 20-year-old daughter who somehow has made it to 20, and she's not steeped in the disease of addiction. She's made it to 20, and she has not been raped or molested. She's made it to 20, and she knows that she has a mother that shows up for her, that has her back. I may not always like the things that she chooses to do. I may not always I may have a big learning curve on learning how to let her be her individual source. I might try and solve things that are not mine to solve for her. I still try and buffer her from any pain that I can. I still want to make sure she's okay, but you know what? I spent some time with her recently, and I just really got, oh my gosh, look at her. She's good. She's got her life. That's a miracle. That's a miracle in my family. I have a man that I love and adore, and he'll be the first to tell you it is not always easy to be in a relationship with me. And And when I'm suffering or when I'm struggling, my default is everybody's out. I need to get out. I can't. I gotta run. So that's hard on him. And he still walks through it with me. I pay taxes. I am a contribution. I work for a very large state agency. I am the State Opioid Response Program Director. And in that position, I create resources and try and problem solve to create solutions to the disease of addiction, specifically opioids. I get to help write policy. I get to be a resource for other women who want to be in recovery. I get to do all of these things today because I do not pick up a drug or a drink. The most important thing to me in my life is my recovery. It has to be above my family, my relationships, my work, everything else. Because if I use any kind of substance that is mind-altering, I will not have any of those things. Which kind of circles back to everything I've said so far. There's nothing special and unique about me. There's not. But there's nothing less than about me either. I get to be just who I am. I don't have to try anymore to be something greater than I am, or fix something, or get rid of all the things that are wrong about me so that I'm enough to have a seat at the table. I don't have to do that anymore. Nor do you. So I think with that, I will say I really, really appreciate the opportunity to share my story with you. And the pathway for me definitely was the 12 steps. And that is not the only pathway. There's medication-assisted treatment. There's a whole bunch of different recovery opportunities. There's, so I would say to you, if you haven't found what you need yet to be a person in long-term recovery from the disease of addiction, don't give up. I would say to you, there's hope. You're not alone. And we're here for you. And you don't even know you don't know. You don't know how good life can be if you are steeped in the disease of addiction. Your best day while using is nothing compared to how good it is on your worst day in recovery. So reach out. Let people love you. That's what happened for me. I went into the rooms and people literally told me, keep coming back, and I was floored by that. I couldn't believe that they wanted me there. And then they taught me how to like myself. And then eventually I started to love myself. They taught me how to have self-esteem by doing esteemable acts. They taught me how to set down things that were not mine. They also taught me that I shouldn't really care what other people think of me. It's none of my business. That one's tough for me. I really want people to like me. So that one's tough for me. But So those are some of the things that really helped me along my journey. And if you need something, and if there's something I can provide for you, feel free to be in contact with our hosts, and they can pass along an email to me, and I will reach back out. I think my emails act like rabbits. So as soon as I close my computer, and then I open it again, there's like 30 more of them. I don't know what happened. They just populate like that. So be persistent if you are trying to get a hold of me, because it might take a couple days. But I will respond to you. And just thank you. Thank you for listening to me. I hope that something I said helped someone today. And if there's anything I said that offended you or didn't resonate for you, leave it behind. You don't have to take it with you. Okay? Thanks so much. Oh, is there any questions or anything I need to respond to? Okay, excellent. Thank you. Yeah, you're welcome.
Mic on? There it is. I have. So thank you, Lexi, and blessings to you. And now we can take a 10-minute break. I do want to make sure you know our partners. I know I don't have it up here right now. Our Mental Health Connect, Faith Partners, and the Center of Addiction and Faith. And Pastor Ed is here too today, and he'll speak a few minutes at the end of our session to share again how it is that we can be a faith community and how we can support others in this journey. So he's here, and take this time to greet our speakers today and take 10 minutes for stretching. Thank you. you all got a little break, take a breath, and we'll come back now to hear how it is that we can come alongside those in recovery, those struggling with addiction, those who love those who love someone who might be dealing with addiction. There's no way that not all of us aren't touched with someone in our lives. So how do we come alongside? But also how we as a faith community can be, as Lexi said, be a voice to put it as a norm, that this isn't something that we put in the back rooms, just in the basements, but that it's here in our building, in our community, and that we just love each other as God wants us to love each other. And so thank you. And Dr. Carla Dahl, please come up, and appreciate you being here this day. She was a professor at Luther Seminary, and I think you probably taught while I was there, but I never had you. But I had friends that told me that you'd be awesome to share in this way.
Them.
So thank you. Yep.
Thanks, Karen.
Yep.
And it's really good to be here in this beautiful space with this beautiful spirit of love and hope. And so let's continue that on in a conversation. Thank you so much, Lexi, for your courage and for your generosity in sharing your story and in being so transparent with us. It is true, as Karen just reiterated, that we have to be able to tell our stories. We have to be able to hear each other's stories. And when we can do that, then there's some hope about being able to say, okay, let's walk together then. So what I would like to do, the next bit here, is to think with you about, as we make all things new, maybe we need to also, or we allow God to make all things new, we don't do that, but to think with you about how we can understand and conceptualize addiction so that we can recognize it in ourselves. We could, even if our story isn't like Lexi's, we can hear it from each other, and so we can listen for it well. And so I want to think with you a little bit first about how do we define addiction? Those of you, is that working? No. Maybe if I turn it right side up. There we go. Okay, so defining addiction. Generally speaking, there are, as Lexi said, a lot of ways of thinking about, a lot of ways of responding to, a lot of entries into and out of addictive processes. But I want to name with you that it is a complex process. It includes psychological components, emotional components, physiological components, neurobiological components with our nervous systems, ours and each other's, social components, and spiritual ones. So it's complex. It's not just one thing. And thinking about that as a complex process means that then what's unique about that process, what's the outcome of that? It's any behavior or use of a substance in which a person finds temporary relief or pleasure and therefore craves that behavior, but in the long run, it causes them or others pain. It brings negative consequences. Yet, the person refuses to or is unable to give it up. Okay, so that sense of how we think about addiction, it's a complex process. It's not simple. It's not, you can never use the word just when you're talking about addiction, because just minimizes and decomplexifies it. And it also is reminding us that this is something that brings a pleasure, brings some kind of relief in the moment. So that's hard to fight. It's hard to fight something that brings relief or pleasure in the moment. One great name I've heard for addiction is that every addiction story is a refugee story. It's escaping from something intolerable. And so listening to those refugee stories, recognizing that if I am escaping something intolerable, whatever helps me do that is going to be really powerful, right? So that kind of as a context for how we're thinking about addiction. Any questions about that or clarifications about that, either from here or online? Sheila can let me know if there's something popping up. Okay. So So that's thinking about it big. It's not, you don't see disease in there, which Lexi was really careful to remind us of the disease of addiction. It doesn't exclude illness, but it doesn't only talk about illness. It's something beyond that too. It's the ways that it affects our social lives, our lives as a congregation. Thinking about how our context, our culture, whatever culture we're part of, whatever subculture we're part of, how those cultures support and reinforce addictive behaviors because of the intolerable nature of those contexts. So how do we think about that if a person is living in a context that is just suffused with pain, with discrimination, with oppression, with exclusion? There's a lot to want to escape. So thinking about how it is that we think not just about an individual who is dealing with an addiction, but how we think about relationships and contexts, congregations, communities, and our whole, the world, how we're reinforcing addictive behaviors. So 3 things to think about then. 3 hallmarks of addiction that are hidden in that definition are, that there is short-term relief or pleasure, and therefore craving. There's a short-term relief or pleasure. That is hallmark of that. There's long-term suffering for oneself and for others, including the larger community, and there's an inability to stop. Lexi referred to it towards the end of her story about it's not just about choosing. You know, this just say no approach is not helpful because the ability to choose is impaired in the brain. When we have gotten into that process where there's short-term relief, long-term consequences and suffering, we still have the capacity to choose has been damaged. So to say they just need to choose differently, they need to use their willpower. Willpower has nothing to do with addiction. So thinking about how it is that the brain has been changed. The brain has been changed by the stress, by the trauma, and is changed by the behavior itself, as we are finding that pleasure or relief in the moment. So short-term relief or pleasure, long-term suffering, and inability to stop, even despite the long-term suffering. So just think for a minute about your own story. And what, if any, behaviors or substances in your life at any point fit those hallmarks? Things that brought you pleasure or relief. Things that caused you some problems or caused other people problems, but you still kept doing them. Just think about it. Perhaps something might come to mind. In the past, in the present, something might fit that definition. One of mine is reflected in this image here. This is, I don't know if you can see it very clearly, but it's the office, the home office of a former Johns Hopkins University. And I look at, professor, and I look at that and I think, what an amateur. I mean, he's got, yeah, there's a lot of books there, you know, and it's not terribly organized, but he's a beginner, in my opinion. Because for me, when I was a little kid, books were my safety. They were my escape from a chaotic, volatile, invasive family. And so being able to take a book and go somewhere else and not be where I was wonderful. It was so wonderful. I noticed as I got older and I started tending to the impact of that family, that whenever I left my therapist's office, I would drive by a bookstore, stop in, pick up something, you know, it felt better. I felt better after having unpacked all that and opened myself up so raw and vulnerable that I could go get a book, because that was safety and comfort. Then I chose a profession so wisely that requires books. Requires books. Professor, you gotta have books. You gotta have the new books and the old books. So it's really, really wonderful and supports this addiction of the books. Now, I am not saying, you did not hear me say reading is my addiction. You heard me say books were my addiction, right? Because I crave buying them. I crave planning out, get my Amazon list ready. It's such a thrill to push submit order, and then they drop on the porch, and I stack them on the pile. I don't run off and read them right away because I couldn't wait to see what that author was going to say. I'll get to it. But it's the actual, where I feel the dopamine hit in my brain is when I'm ordering, and then they come. Okay, that feels better. That makes sense? Sound familiar? So, and that's just one of the ways that I find relief or pleasure in the moment. And I can't stop buying books. I can't stop ordering them. I retired a year and a half ago. I have 3 books coming today. Hopefully when I get home, they'll be on the porch. I also saw Barnes & Noble on my way here, so I think we're good. So responses to that, what does that catch in you when you think about addiction broadly defined? Anything, or anybody online have an observation? Pardon? Caffeine? Okay, food, games. Yeah. You can recognize that process, right? Anything else? Changing how we're feeling. Say more about that.
Like the compulsion to escape like the current feeling through something
Yeah.
outside of ourselves.
Yep. Something outside of ourselves. And the challenge is to remind ourselves that, and we'll talk about this in just, well, I'll do it right now, to remind ourselves that anything can become addictive, nothing must become addictive. Anything can become addictive. Work, exercise, prayer, things that are inherently good in themselves or even inherently neutral. But when we use them to get out of the present moment, to change the facing our reality, that's when we are running into that area of finding pleasure or relief in this thing, even though it might be a good thing, especially if it's causing problems for us or other people. How can you complain about how much I work? I'm doing the Lord's work. God's not complaining about how much I work, just you are. Interesting. We can frame that, and we will frame it so that we have some kind of permission to continue this behavior, right? So this helps us to do one thing that we're going to talk about in a few minutes, I think is essential in faith communities. It helps us stay humble. I don't get to look at somebody else's life and say, oh, wow, look at that addict over there. Name them as a category. Decide that's all that's true about them. I actually have to say, I understand that. I understand that. Because if you cut off my Amazon Prime, I will be very angry with you. Not because you're messing around with my computer, but because you are taking away from me the thing that for my whole life, since I started to read, has been my safety, my comfort, and has brought me out of where I am in the moment. Okay? So anything can become addicting. Nothing must become addicting. My best friend took OxyContin for 20 years on the advice of her physician. When he said, it's time to stop, she stopped. It wasn't an issue for her. So OxyContin, this dangerous thing, which is very dangerous for a lot of people, and Lexi can explain how and what we need to do about that opioid epidemic, it doesn't necessarily by itself become problematic. Anything can be, nothing must be. This is where we have to remind ourselves of looking at our own experiences, reflecting on our own story too. Okay? So that's one piece. Anything can, nothing must. Addiction is also, I think, important for us to remember, it's a disruption of relationship. It's a disruption of a relationship with ourselves. It's a disruption of our relationship with the thing or the behavior that we're using. It's a disruption of a relationship with people that we love or who love us. It's a disruption of relationship to the world. I am not able to say, here is the truth, I will turn toward it. Without judging, I'll just turn toward it. Actually, I need to judge it. I need to define it in particular ways so that I can ignore the fact that it has disrupted those relationships. But relationships are disrupted. This gives us a clue to what we can do to be helpful in tending to addictions. Relationship has to be restored. That has to be something that happens in our work around addiction. Restoring relationship to ourselves, restoring a right relationship to the behavior of the substance, restoring relationship to people we have harmed. This is part of the 12-step, right? I make amends where it doesn't do more damage. I will make amends for this. I will restore the relationship. And I restore my relationship to God, where I know that I'm a dearly loved child, not carrying the shame into my conversations with God, into my experience with my faith community that says, I am not good enough to be here. I'm not worthy. We are able to see ourselves as the beloved. And when we see ourselves as the beloved, that's the beginning of restoring that relationship between ourselves and ourselves and others, ourselves and God, and ourselves and the world. So that's another thing to remember. And then finally, that addiction is inextricably linked to trauma. We have a lot of conversation around trauma right now in this country and in Europe as well, but we have stopped defining trauma only as the big T traumas. You're in a war. You are in a horrible car accident. You are attacked, assaulted, raped. Those used to be thought of as that's what's trauma, that those big things that happen to us. We understand now that trauma includes much more, and very few of us escape some kind of trauma, small t trauma. Doesn't mean that small t traumas are less disturbing or disruptive or distressing than big T traumas, but we have just now started talking about them more so that we can look at neglect, serious neglect in a home, as traumatizing for the kids in that home. Okay? We can look at long-term oppression and discrimination against persons and groups as long-term trauma. It's traumatizing, meaning it's telling us we're not safe and we can't protect ourselves. It changes our feeling of safety in the world. Where was God when this happened? It really challenges our sense of coherence. Things don't hang together when we've experienced trauma. In addition, those of us who work with, minister to, live with people who have been seriously traumatized can experience vicarious traumatization. We're around people who have experienced that kind of trauma, especially the big T traumas, a lot, and we find ourselves feeling the same kind of question. Is the world safe? Does God love me? Is this the way it's supposed to be? And fortunately, we see in our sacred writings, we see, for example, in the Psalms, lament that says quite clearly, this is not as it is supposed to be. This is not how the world should be. And we are given lots of permission to complain and to argue and to be honest with God. It implies we could be honest with each other too, then, about our lament. This is not how the world should be. Okay? So we can talk more about trauma in just a second, but let me just pause and see if there's something where I lost you or said something unclear. More than one thing, perhaps, but. Any questions or observations that come?
I have a question.
Mm-hmm.
What do you feel about having the pandemic? Did that have a big mark on us as a world?
So the question is, what about the pandemic? Does it have a big mark on us as a world? Yes. I think we're talking more about trauma now because we've had so much of it in the last 3 years. Recognizing that we have had losses that were very ambiguous, that we didn't know what we were losing. I remember about maybe 6 months into the lockdown, I read that the Uptown Theater had closed and wasn't going to reopen. And I felt just bereft. I thought, oh, we go there every couple of weeks. I mean, we love this place. It provides pleasure and relief. And I thought, Carla, this is a little extreme. It's a theater and it closed. There are other theaters. You can actually go see movies someplace else. And I recognized after I reflected on it for a while, but I didn't get to say goodbye. I didn't get to go one more time. Well, why is that such a big deal? Well, because my mom was killed in a car accident. I never got to say goodbye. And all that was in there that was still holding that traumatic experience got wakened up. Like, oh, see, you don't get to say goodbye sometimes. It's really awful. So for a lot of us, the pandemic kind of surfaced those things. We had horrible losses, people that we couldn't say goodbye to. They died on a ventilator. They died, we could say goodbye on an iPad maybe, but that was it. We had disruptions of family rituals, graduations, weddings, birthdays, grandchildren, all that was disrupted. And the pileup of that, plus we were unsafe, and we didn't know how we were unsafe. If I walk through this aisle of Target, am I going to catch COVID? But if I walk through this one, I won't. If I wear a mask or two, will that help me or not? If I get a vaccine, I mean, we just had all these unknowables. That's traumatizing. So the pandemic has affected all of us. We see, in my practice, I see a lot more depression. I see a lot more anxiety. I see a lot more kind of vulnerability. I see more irritability. That happens when we have experienced trauma. And we have experienced as a group. It's not that just one of you experienced that. You all experienced it. Karen was telling me about how this congregation had to adjust to doing online worship. How do we do that? And is it the same? I had students at Luther who were involved in really deep discussions about, is it okay to do communion, not in a group? Can you do communion just in people's homes? Can they have their own little packs? And no, yes, they can. No, they can't. Martin would never have liked that. Just these big discussions about what was wrong and what was right. And I think those came out of anxiety. We just didn't know what we were supposed to do. So we need to be gentle with ourselves and each other. That in this time, which we're not done yet, now we talk about a triple-demic, and it's the flu and the RSV and the COVID. Well, that doesn't help. Now there's even more to be dangerous. So recognizing that heightens all of our stress hormones in our bodies. We are created whole people. Our bodies are created in certain ways. Stress hormones, the adrenaline, cortisol, they're supposed to help us in the moment. When the saber-toothed tiger is chasing us, the adrenaline helps us run. Well, when you're trapped, there's no place to run to, but those stress hormones are still circulating in your body, that's not how our bodies were designed. They're created to have a burst of stress hormones, take the action, and then resolve. But with trauma, especially long-term trauma, we end up always having that heightened stress response, which creates inflammation, which has all kinds of health issues. And the stress response that gets activated, that's healthy, that's normal, but not the long term. Our organs were not designed to soak in cortisol or soak in adrenaline. It's supposed to be in and out. So yeah, the pandemic has had an impact, and it's not done having an impact. I think we're going to deal with grief, delayed grief, for years as congregations, in therapy practices, in pastoral counseling. We're going to deal with that for a long time because of the residue of what's happened to us. Question? Yeah.
I just wanted to add a comment. I know because of people being socially isolated during the pandemic, addiction rates skyrocketed even further, and overdoses were higher, and 12-step programs were unavailable. Treatment centers were much more shut in, and
Yep. Yep. The comment here is that the pandemic, also the lockdown especially, had a really deleterious effect on rates of addiction, that people used substances and behaviors more because they had to find relief from this terror and from the sadness and from the uncertainty. And we'll deal with that too. We'll continue to see the impact of that. Okay? So let's talk a little bit more about trauma, because some of the newer thinking about addiction is that it is all related to trauma, that different kinds of trauma, the small t trauma and the big T trauma, so that we are able to recognize ourselves and our own stories in what we are encountering, and to hear each other's stories with more compassion, more graciousness. Lexi referred briefly to ACEs, the Adverse Childhood Experiences score that she was talking about. This was a really a huge turning point in thinking about health, physical health, mental health, and addiction in the late 90s, when there was Vincent Felitti, his name is on the slide, did a huge study with people, asking people who had diabetes, heart conditions, kind of what we call the lifestyle illnesses. We're not going to use that term after today, okay? Nobody has lifestyle illnesses that imply they have all this choice. Because what he heard from the stories of people who had those kinds of physical afflictions was he kept hearing the stories of their childhood and how stressful those childhoods were. So he, from his stories, identified 10 ways in which a child could experience something adverse that would be what we'd now call traumatizing. And there were 3 categories that he included. The active abuse, physical, emotional, or sexual abuse. Neglect, physical or emotional neglect. So you could have been providing everything for your child, but if you never were talking to them, never seeing their emotion, never encouraging them, it didn't matter that they got to the dentist on time or that they had enough food to eat. The emotional neglect was traumatizing as well. And then household dysfunctions, and the ones that he identified from the stories, and I think we could extrapolate out at this point 20 years later, but we identified were alcoholism or drug use in the home, divorce or loss of a biological parent, depression or mental illness in the home, the mother being treated violently, or an incarcerated family member. And so there were 10 adverse childhood experiences that he identified that seemed to group themselves into dynamics that then showed up later in life, in adult life. And this is fascinating research. Nadine Burke-Harris has a great book about this. She's kind of been the spokesperson for this study out in the world. Find her TED Talk. It's fascinating. She does a 14-minute summary of what they discovered in their research. But what was determined was that if a kid had 6 of the 10, as an adult, they were 46 times more likely to use IV drugs. 6 of the 10 adverse experiences, 46 times more likely to use IV drugs. How do you see those connected to each other? How do those relate? Is that just playing with numbers like statisticians do? What do you see? There's a lot to escape there, isn't there? There's a lot of comfort that a kid might need throughout their lives when they think back to the impact of those household disruptions, that abuse or that neglect. Again, on their physical bodies. Kids are fabulous observers and crappy interpreters. They notice everything and they decide it's about them. And so their determination of why this is all happening, because I'm not good enough. So the shame and stigma that Lexi talked about, those are kind of baked in to a kid. This is happening because I'm somehow unworthy. I am less adequate. So that hypervigilance is a stress kind of response. The, Frank Anderson, a family therapist, says that trauma hinders love, and love is required to heal trauma. Most addiction, he says, is the effort not to find love, but to make up for the lack of it, desperately to make up for the lack of it that was experienced early. And again, you can see with these kinds of early childhood learnings that the kid is being taught, here's what the world is like. Here's what people around you are like. And all this happens, this bad stuff, because you somehow are wrong. That's a really powerful lesson. To learn that about the world as a kid, then we are going to be looking for ways to find pleasure or relief as adults, as young adults, as older adults. And that helps us, again, hold a little more compassion and generosity when we're listening to people's stories. It's not just, so you decided to do drugs. That was a kind of a bad decision, wasn't it? No, it was a very logical decision. It's very logical, given the experience that had happened so far. Comments about that or questions online? Sheila, anything? Okay.
Comment, how we just sort of brush over those childhood events.
Yeah.
Like a divorce.
Yeah.
It's common, but we just say, because it's so common that they just got through it without any effect.
Yeah. Yeah, we have this belief that I think comes out of our own anxiety that kids are resilient. They bounce back. Yeah, they do. And they bounce back with this new programming that says the world is not safe and you need to make it good for everybody else in your world, in your context. And if you behave a little bit better, then maybe this won't happen again. And if you can somehow do whatever your abuser is, if you can kind of keep around the edges so that they don't ever see you, then, well, that's really smart. It's very creative. How great that a kid can learn to survive that way. And then they end up in adult relationships, and they're still trying to kind of avoid intimacy, and they're trying to not be known by their partners or by their families. And they're trying to, they come in faith community, they look great, they're really productive, they're very great volunteers, and they're still doing that kind of, if I just do it right, then I will be loved, then I will be safe. So it's long term. The programming, they're resilient. They will figure out how to survive something. Sometimes the way we figure out how to survive, say, abuse, is we go to another place. It's called dissociation. If I'm being hurt in the present moment, and I can't escape that, then how smart for me to leave mentally if I can't leave physically? That's pretty smart. But again, later in life, when I feel stressed or unsafe, I leave. I leave mentally, I leave emotionally, because that's what kept me safe. So again, hearing that this all makes sense. It all makes sense. It's not about somebody who made a weird choice, came out of nowhere, that drug addiction. My aunt, my dad's younger sister, just the two of them, grew up in a little tiny town, northwestern North Dakota. Dad was the golden child in the community, about 250. Very, very strict mother. And in her family, that generational level, everyone but her died of some alcohol-related thing. Froze to death when they were drunk, died in a bar fight, cirrhosis. I mean, everything was. So grandma had a very militant teetotaler mindset. Understandably, she lost all her family in these alcohol-related ways. So when my Aunt Betty, who I loved dearly, was about 14, she started disappearing in the evenings, and my dad was sent out to find her, and he'd check the bars and find her in one of the bars, which a 14-year-old should not be allowed to be in the bar, but there she was, and drinking. And so the question became, well, what are we going to do about Betty? She's, making these bad choices. She's doing things that we think are sin. She's, lots of judgment about Betty. And nobody asked, well, why? Why would a 14-year-old girl in a small community where it was going to be known get drunk? Wonder about that. Start wondering, if we're thinking about our context that we've defined now, start wondering, what's she finding relief from? Oh, being sexually abused. Didn't come out for decades that was part of her story. She was sent to treatment facility after treatment facility where she was abused by her psychiatrists. It was a horrible story. And no one thought to ask, why? How is this a sensible decision? Okay? So when we are thinking about trauma and addiction, the two questions that we want to ask are not what's wrong with the addiction, but what's right with it. How is it working? How is it bringing relief or pleasure? And the second one, not why the addiction, but why the pain that led to the addiction. So when I learned, my aunt became sober in her 40s, and we had a great relationship. She told me all kinds of stories about her life as an alcoholic, about her kids, about her several husbands. It was just, but she could make sense of it at that point. She got sober, she had a lot of help thinking through what was this about. My dad never understood that. He kept talking about Betty's sin. Dad was a pastor, golden child in this little community, and that was his context, was this was a sin issue. Yeah, Dad, it was much bigger than that. It was about finding some relief from the danger she was in at home. And that sense of understanding brings us to these questions. So when you're listening to someone's question, or when you're thinking about programming in a congregation, listening to someone's story, you want to wonder, what was working in the addiction? What was it accomplishing? And why was this addiction useful for the pain? What was the pain about? Because if we can realize that adverse childhood experiences have a huge link to addictive behaviors, then we can think about starting with the adverse childhood experiences. How do we as a congregation help kids be safe? Not just feel safe, but be safe. Not rely on, well, kids are resilient, so we don't need to pay much attention to that. We have the capacity in faith communities to change the external environment for a kid. Not always in their home, but they get different messages from us. You are loved. You are important. God loves you. You're safe here. And we got to be sure they are. So we tend to then, what do we do as a faith community that lets us help to move some of that pain out of people's lives? Then the addiction is not as necessary. At that point, of course, the brain has been shaped enough that it may be impossible to stop because the capacity to choose has been diminished. So we think about, well, then how do we support the kinds of partners? You have partners in your work here that were listed on the screen a few minutes ago. How do we work with partners to do the kind of restorative, relational repair work? Yeah.
I have an almost 4-year-old at home, right? And he witnessed abusive divorce. I have depression. I'm in sobriety now, and I'm just telling a little bit too much of my own story. But what factors exist for the children that don't become addicted later in life? Like what you said, 6 out of 10 of those things, if they're true, then they're much more likely. And so I guess, have they done research on why don't some children?
Yeah.
What happens to the ones, or what can we do for them?
Yep. So how do some kids escape that, right? One of the primary findings, I think, in the research is that there are protective factors around kids who, all kids, not just kids who are in troublesome homes or difficult environments. But there are protective factors like community resources. Are there places that kids can go? Are there people who will tend to their physical needs? Are there United Way services or whatever? But the primary thing that stands out in the research is that some safe relationship, and it only needs to be one. It's kind of shocking that one safe, authentic relationship can be a protective factor for kids. So again, what does that say to us as faith communities? We might be that one safe, authentic relationship to some kid who's only in our space once or twice a week, maybe, if that. But protective factors include primarily these safe relationships. So it may be with you that your child has a safe relationship, a safe, authentic relationship. It could be with a neighbor, could be with a grandparent, could be with somebody, at school. And the more they have, the better. But what grace is it that it only takes one? That's just such a gift that we can find that protection and that safety with one deep, safe, authentic relationship. Does that make sense? And again, let's not ignore the other protective factors like community resources and safe spaces and food security and relevant health care. So we want to be partnering with people in the community for that too, as a faith community. But we have this capacity to do a relationship. Other questions? Yeah.
I just think about our schools and how important schools need to be safe, how hard it is for them to be safe. And then you think about, schools, inner city schools, that can't be a safe place. And just how hard it is to be well. And there's no, why not? Why not have a problem that we have?
Yeah. Pardon? Yep. That schools aren't safe necessarily, and in some communities they're even less safe than in other communities. But the phrase that I love that you said, Karen, was how hard it is to be well. How hard it is. Yes. So how can we be so compassionate with people who are wrestling with challenging issues, who are saying, I gotta find relief somewhere from this thing that's intolerable. I can't take it. This is my refugee story. So we hear the story and we provide that because it's so hard to be well. The culture around us doesn't support that. It exacerbates the challenges. Achieve in this way, look this way. If you're not part of this group, then you're less than. If you are part of this group, then we can ignore you or hurt you. It's just kind of, overwhelming to think about the challenges that we have in the way of being well. So let's think about, what wellness is, that it isn't being perfect, but that it is growing toward wholeness, as we were created to do. So let's think more specifically about how faith communities can contribute to healing. 3 things I think matter a lot. One is compassion. And I do not mean pity. I do not mean hearing a story like Lexi's and going, oh, wow, that's really sad. Boy, I'm glad that didn't happen to me. It's saying, I hear everyone's story with this deep compassion. Compassion meaning I hold it tenderly, not with judgment, not with harshness. I recognize that it's such a common human experience to suffer. And I turn toward it without judging it. I turn toward it. I don't try to banish. I don't try to look away or ignore. I turn toward. And this helps us to offer compassion to ourselves as well as to somebody else. If I'm wrestling with my own, Amazon order and feeling like, why can't I get a handle on this? I'm racking up too much debt. This is not going to work well in retirement for me to have all these books that are piled up that I'm tripping over and breaking a hip, but I can't pay for them. So can I turn toward that? Can I say, you know what, this is hard. It's hard to recognize that this has been, for 63 years, a comfort and a place of safety, and that you might not use that anymore. That's hard. and be gentle, gentle. And say, you know, people suffer with this. A lot of people struggle, not necessarily with Amazon, but they struggle with how am I going to stop doing something that's causing me pain? Common human experience. And then I can turn toward it without judging it to say, well, let's look at this then. Let's look at what seems to need comfort now, what seems to need relief now. I'm not going to judge it, because if I judge it, it's just going to get louder. I have to be able to turn toward it without judging it. And this is how we offer compassion to ourselves and to each other. I can hear your story and hold it tenderly. I can remind you this is part of being human. This is part of our life here. And I can say, let's look at it without judging it, without being harsh, without criticizing it. Let's say, why is it working? Why has it been useful all these years? Why is the pain there? Okay, so that first piece of compassion, not pity. Does that make sense about something we can offer in our faith communities? We can hold each other's stories that way. A second thing is humility. If we are going to talk about addiction in our faith communities, we need to drop the self-righteousness. We need to be able to say, I can see how that could happen. I can hear that in your story. I can recognize it in my own. I can realize that I also deal with, anxiety or with some kind of diagnosed mental illness, but that's not all who I am. I am not anxiety. I have anxiety. I'm not depression. I have depression. How can I be humble with my own story and not say to anybody else, you have to change? This is where I have a problem with things like tough love. Let's just do love. Yes, set boundaries. Yes, let's be clear that we're not going to tolerate bad behavior, and then figure out ways to protect people from bad behavior. But tough love that says, I get to be out of relationship with you until you get your act together. No. That's a kind of a fundamentalism that is really non-relational. It says, I know what's right, and I'd rather be right than be in a relationship with you. It's not going to work. That's not humble. We can come with passionate convictions about what healthy behavior is or what God is like or anything else, but we have to come with humility that says, I could be wrong. I could be wrong because I'm human. I don't have the right answer for everything. I'm not going to force you into, there were some shows, maybe they're still on, but there were some shows a few years ago on TV that were like interventions. You could watch an intervention being forced on somebody who was struggling with an addiction. And it's like, when did that become entertainment? That we watch someone struggling with pain and we watch people try to force them into what they think they should be doing. Sure, support people into healing places. Sure. However we can, let's support rehab. Let's support recovery ministries. Let's do that. But let's not say, I know it's right for you, therefore you have to go do that. Otherwise, no, I'm not going to be in a relationship with you. We need more humility than that. And so being able to say, what is my story of addiction, comprehensively defined, and how do I think with grace and generosity, listening to yours, I will be less harsh. Which leads us to presence. The third thing we can offer in faith communities is presence. Being with. Being with when the path is muddy and dark. Being with as we celebrate some kind of milestone. Being with as a person is confused or feeling lost. We be with. And that's going to require compassion and humility to really offer useful presence, healing presence. But remember, we said at the beginning, addiction is a disruption of relationship. Presence is a way of offering relationship that is part of the healing. I will be with you. If you're shut down and you don't know where to go about this, I can be quiet. I don't have to yammer louder and talk more so that you can figure out what I think you should do. I'll be quiet while you listen, till you feel it's safe to come back and be present with me. If you're lashing out and angry and furious, I'll be present. It doesn't scare me away. I don't have to retaliate back. I don't have to lash out because you lashed out at me. I can say, I get that that's coming from a place of fear and rage and pain. I get that. I'm okay. I'll be fine. I can take care of myself. You don't have to behave better for me to be present with you. You know, that even one of the stories that I love about Jesus in healing is with Bartimaeus, the blind guy who, says, Jesus, 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 and Jesus says, what do you want me to do for you? Well, when I read that at first, I think, Jesus, he's blind. Obviously, he wants you to help him see. Just pay attention. Jesus says, no, what do you want me to do for you? You name it. You say it, and I will be with you in that healing. Wow. That's amazing presence. And we can do that. We can offer that sense of, what do you want me to do for you? What do you need from me? You don't have to ask politely for it. You might ask in a very rude, disruptive way, but I will listen with compassion and humility so I can stay present with you. Thoughts about those three things?
It just reminded me of there was a policy for people that are experiencing homelessness, and it still is a policy in many places that they have to be sober before they can receive housing.
Yeah.
And how unsuccessful that was.
Yeah.
And then there was this pilot program that started giving housing to people while they were still using and while they were still ill, and how I don't remember the number, but it was such a huge increase in the number that actually got into recovery once they had their needs met, because they needed safe housing and food security and people, community, and then they were able to achieve long-term sobriety.
Yep.
Some of them.
Yep. Yeah, to say, heal yourself before I'll help you is not useful. Pardon me? Yeah, the housing, people dealing with homelessness are sometimes told that they have to be sober before they can be placed in housing, and how that's not a successful approach. So thank you for that example of, again, having an opinion about, well, this should happen. So if we just make it really hard for somebody, then they'll be motivated to get sober. Yeah, probably not. Because what are they trying to do? Oh yeah, find relief. So making it harder is not helping them find relief. Other comments or thoughts?
And I think that goes with the harm reduction approach to dealing with addiction, is to just provide a safe place.
Yeah.
So needle exchange,
Yeah.
providing housing even when they are addicted, giving a safe place so they don't die. And what they find are people will come towards
Yeah.
recovery because of that.
Yeah, because we're inviting, we're not commanding, we're not demanding. We're saying, I will be present with you. What do you need? I have a friend who was coming out of a store, and there was a person there with a sign, anything will help, homeless, 4 kids. And she was with a friend, and she took out some money from her billfold and handed it to the person, and as they walked away, her friend said, they're just going to use that for drugs. And my friend said, what they do with it is between them and God. Me giving it to them is between me and God. That sense of, how do I bring a generous spirit to the suffering of others? We could think differently about, is it effective really to demand somebody do something? It doesn't work for me. When somebody says you have to, I kind of get a little obstreperous about that inside. No, you don't. No, you can't make me. It's a real mature part of me, but it's very much there.
I'll just comment also on to be a family member of someone who's an addict and how you live in that illness as the one who's going alongside and loving that person. There are some boundaries though that do come up that might say, I can't have you in the house while you're using.
Yep.
So those are just also, but that comes out of your own compassion to yourself, to say, I can't keep doing this to myself,
Yep.
to watch you die.
Yep.
So, yeah,
Yes, yes.
it's the approach.
Yeah, presence and compassion never require us to tolerate bad behavior or dangerous behavior. Sometimes people are at risk and they need to be protected. Kids need to be protected. Elderly folks need to be protected. All of us need protection from predators, from people who are not able to live well in relationship. Faith communities need to say who can and cannot be involved in some kinds of programs. But it's the spirit behind which we say that. You know, my boundary is I won't allow that treatment of our child, so you'll need to move. You know, it's not saying you need to be different, you need to change. It's I won't allow this. This is my boundary. My boundary isn't telling you what you have to do. My boundary is saying what I will and won't tolerate. So yes, Debbie. Someone online? No.
The comment is, do we know the difference between helping and enabling? Do we know the difference between helping and enabling?
Do you know the difference between helping and enabling? Well, some of us try to figure out that difference, right? And some of us really don't care if there's a difference. It's like, well, I'll just do what I think I should do. I think part of the deal with helping, as distinct from enabling, is helping should start with the question Jesus asked Bartimaeus, what do you need me to do for you? To kind of jump in and do rescuing when someone can do something for themselves is not useful. That's the enabling or the rescue stuff that is not helpful. A true rescue is when somebody can't do something to save themselves or to protect themselves. An inauthentic rescue is when I say, well, this is what should happen, so I'm going to jump in and do this. And frankly, those inauthentic rescues mean that we are going to end up being the enemy sometimes. When we have jumped in and said, here's what you should do, I'll do this for you. When you actually could do it for yourself, and maybe should do it for yourself, but I'll help you because you can't, because you're so weak, or you're so, so that's not useful. And the enabling piece is to say, I won't tell the truth about the behavior that I experience. I won't say, this is not acceptable for me. I'm not going to tolerate this. And sometimes those of us on the edges of people who are really struggling with addictions is, how do I know what I will and won't tolerate? How do I know what's okay? So we all need that sense of support to say, this is a true thing for me. This is part of what I am requesting. Can I help you as we're trying to figure out how we can be in relationship? Maybe. Maybe somebody else needs to help you. But enabling is no more helpful than an inauthentic rescue, where we're jumping in to say, here's what I think should happen. Okay? Anything else online? Okay. Well, I want to leave some time for your pastoral team to have something to say here. So let me just end with part of a blessing from John O'Donohue, the late John O'Donohue, who was a brilliant poet and thinker, a former priest, Irish priest. He has a book of blessings called To Bless the Space Between Us that are just lovely. And he has one for an addict, a blessing for an addict. The last couple verses are on the slide, but let me read a few verses that start before that. A blessing. May some glimmer of outside light reach your eyes to help you recognize how you have fallen for a vampire. May you crash hard and soon onto real ground again, where this fundamentalist shell might start to crack, for you to hear again your own echo. That your lost, lonesome heart might learn to cry out for the true intimacy of love that waits to take you home to where you are known and seen, and where your life is treasured beyond every frontier of despair you have crossed. Thank you for your good thinking and your good hearts about this important issue, and may you experience some of that joy that comes with a restored relationship.
Thank you, Paula. Thank you. I can see why everyone loves you at Luther, and that's why Pastor Jonathan's here, I'm sure, to hear you again. And yeah, we have these wonderful partners in our, for us here at Shepherd of the Lake to help and guide us in our care and to be a strong presence at Shepherd of the Lake as a mental health and addiction team. So the Center of Addiction and Faith being one, but also Mental Health Connect, who is a resource for us that we can use if people are having some needing to navigate health services in the metro. If you just call us and tell us you want some help, we'll connect you to a navigator, and they'll find what your resources are in the metro, and they provide a lot of. So you don't even have to contact us to do that. You could also just call Mental Health Connect and tell them you're part of the community of Shepherd of the Lake Lutheran Church. And they also provide educational opportunities for us as leaders and for the community to learn more. And Faith Partners also provides education for addiction, and that is also, they were part of the training for our team. They spent many hours with Faith Partners on learning more about addiction and how we can be a strong team in this community. And so now I'm just going to invite Pastor Ed, my husband, up for just to talk about the Center of Addiction and Faith and how it is a resource for us and for others who might be online and learning more about how to do ministry in this area. Yep.
Thank you, Karen. She made me be here today. Oh, I'm kidding. I'm delighted to be here. This has been great. Carla, thank you for your sharing. I'm delighted that somebody at Luther knows so much and can share that with students. Part of our passion is that our culture doesn't know enough about this problem to deal with it, and we have a lot of work to do to catch up. We have Mark Nupin, a retired pediatrician here, and he will tell you that the medical community doesn't know much about this disease either, and so we're dealing with something where there's a lot of ignorance, and that's what we want to challenge and to try to raise awareness so that people know what they're dealing with. I'm a person in long-term recovery. I'm a Lutheran pastor. I was a parish pastor for 25 years, and I started using because I grew up in a very traumatic home, and when I had that first drink, it fixed me. And I just knew that it worked, and that's what I wanted to do, was feel better. And so that was that's what motivated me. And I grew up in a large family where a lot of us had the same issue because we were all traumatized by our childhood. And so a lot of us went that way. But it was my mom who saved us. She was our chief enabler, but when she finally got an education, excuse me, my brother went to treatment, and because of him, she went to family treatment, and she got an education, and she realized what she was dealing with, and so that she became the person to intervene. And one thing I know about addiction is that an addict cannot save themselves. They are desperately wanting help, but they cannot ask for it. They really need someone to intervene. And that's what my mom did in my life. She kept confronting me and saying, "How's your drinking?" I hated that question. My drinking's fine. Hated that question, but it finally got through to me, and when I finally hit bottom and needed help, I turned to my mom, and she got me the help I needed. And then I think that's the role the church can play in this pandemic, and this addiction problem is a pandemic. It's bigger than the COVID problem. It's killing young people, and it's taking lives of people who don't want to die. I mean, 107,000 lives, and most of them were accidental. People were just trying to feel better, and they're now dead. And there's things that we can be doing to intervene, and it begins with getting an education. And so the Center of Addiction and Faith was born out of the idea that we need to raise awareness. I know a lot of my clergy colleagues know very little about this problem, and I think about all the people that turn to church for help, and there's so little there for them. And we really want to change that. We want to make resources available to people when they come into the church. I came into the church many times throughout my using struggle. Whenever I'd hit bottom, I would think, I gotta do something. I gotta change my life. I gotta get right with God. Where do you do that? Well, you go to church. And I would go to church, and I would sit through a service, and I'd walk away going, there's really nothing here for me. There's no help for me here. And over that happened. And I feel like churches could do more. And so that's what inspired this whole idea of the Center of Addiction and Faith. We are a prophetic voice trying to get churches to understand this problem better, to recognize addicts when they do walk in, and also to be a voice of intervention, so that when they recognize someone with an addiction problem, they can befriend them. Because right now what happens is we're afraid of them. We sort of push them away and keep them in the margins because we're afraid of the problem. So I think we can change that. Tomorrow during worship, we're going to hear about the demoniac. Jesus went right to this crazy person who had mental health issues and probably addiction problems as well. He didn't avoid them. He went right to them. And that's what I think we're called to do, is not to avoid people who are struggling, but to go right to them. And when we do, it transforms. It makes a huge difference. So I invite you to learn about the Center of Addiction and Faith. We have a table set up upstairs, and there's this little card on the table, and it is a phone app, and it's chocked full of great resources. I invite you to take it and download it. Our webinars are on there, information about our annual conference. There's a help finder, so if you're looking for specific help for either mental health or addiction problems, it'll help you find the right treatment center, the right counselor. There's devotions on here. There's a podcast you can listen to as you're driving somewhere about, I interview other pastors who have gone through recovery. And these stories are transformational. They are just powerful because they're God stories. It's how God made a difference in someone's lives, very much like we heard from Lexi today. Powerful stuff. Anyway, thank you for the opportunity to share about this ministry and the work we're doing. And thanks to Karen and Shepherd of the Lake for being a leader in this work. There are not many congregations doing this, and they need to be. Thank you.
Close. We don't have to stay just for the sake of staying. Share with one another, greet one another, and I will send you with a blessing. The Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord's face shines on you with grace and mercy, and the Lord looks upon you with favor and wants for you to have peace. In the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Amen. Go in peace to love and serve the Lord and share the message. Amen.